The intercultural communication event I'd like to discuss, it took place this summer when I was in Bali. I was part of a volunteer team that worked inside of schools and hospitals, and I was teaching English or exercising the service users' cognitive abilities. So I'm going to be going over one of these, a specific instance that occurred at one of these sessions, and the communication that I'm about to discuss is going to include myself as well as people from Canadian, Balinese, European, and Asian backgrounds. So I'm going to begin by going over the cultural context in this situation to shed some light onto the Balinese culture and their perspective and how that has affected some of the things that occurred in this situation. So the Balinese culture is a high context culture. So much of their communication is dependent upon the context that it occurs in. Therefore, when I was teaching these sessions, I have to be very careful with my tone, the situation that I'm speaking in, as well as who I'm speaking to when using particular words. In American culture, on the other hand, we are low context and our meaning is usually derived directly from the words themselves. So the Balinese culture, aside from that, they're also a highly collectivistic culture, which is very different from the majority of the other cultures that were in this session that I'm about to talk about. And collectivistic cultures have a tendency to put their group before themselves and tend to act for the continued harmony of the group. And this was very clear in the sessions that I was teaching because many of the service users that I was teaching, they would go out of their way to make sure that their friends or the group weren't left behind if they were having a hard time with the activity that I was teaching them. And then American culture, on the other hand, is highly individualistic. So we value independence and freedom, and we often think of ourselves before the group. And then finally, the Balinese culture is one of a very high power distance. It is expected in their country that the children obey the elders, and there's a strong power hierarchy throughout the entire culture. And this was very prevalent to me when I was teaching some of the children. They are extremely obedient to their parents, and they never talk back or anything. And as well, the country has a very strong patriarchy, and in each household, the man is the head of the household. And then finally, some of the things that are considered very normal in American culture can actually be very offensive in other cultures. And there was an example of this that I had to learn while teaching these sessions. And that example is in Bali, either pointing with your finger or with your left hand is actually considered very offensive. And when you're teaching someone, a lot of times you're going to end up pointing, and in their culture it is deemed offensive because it actually goes against their religion. Their religion has tenets that make it so that you're only supposed to gesture with your right hand, and then if you add on the pointing of the finger, it's just perceived as demanding. So next we're going to talk about how this communication event would have been different if both or all the participants had been from the same culture. So if I spoke the same language as the Balinese individuals that I was teaching, there would have been no language barrier at all, which was a big factor while I was trying to teach them, and I would have been able to explain the activities to them in their own language, and I also would have not slipped up and ended up pointing my fingers or anything like that. One of the activities the other volunteers and I created was based around the volunteers teaching the service users about their own country, as well as teaching them, as well as the Balinese teaching us about their home country. So since everyone involved in this activity was from different backgrounds, as I mentioned, Canada, Europe, Bali, and Asia, that came into play when we were teaching each other the cultures, and if we were all from the same culture, then we wouldn't have had all of that information to offer each other. And the next question I'm going to go over is, was the communication within this encounter effective communication, and how do I know? So the communication within this encounter was effective because the goal of it was to teach the service users our culture and our perspective, and for them to teach us ours. And then at the end of it, we swapped off and explained each other's countries to each other. So the Balinese taught me a little bit about America, and I taught them about Bali, each from what we learned from each other. And now we're going to talk about if the communication itself was appropriate, and how do I know if it was appropriate. So before teaching these sessions, our entire team was given a briefing on Balinese manners, etiquette, and expectations. So we were able to do our best to be aware of their norms and expectations. So when I was teaching this, I was able to be very aware of things like the pointing fingers or particular words. And I think that if I didn't know that, I probably would have done those gestures more, because I didn't know, and I could have very well wound up offending someone. And also, while we were working on these sessions, we had translators with us that monitor our teaching and our communication with the service users. So they could give us a tap on the shoulder if we did something inappropriate. And then finally, we're going to go over what makes this an intercultural communication encounter. So at the center of this situation is purely intercultural communication. This is because it involved individuals from Balinese, Canadian, American, Asian, and United Kingdom culture, all of whom were explaining their own cultures to each other through communication. And that is all. Thank you.